Hi everyone, William here with the Grand Duke Dmitri YouTube series. If I look a little scruffy today, well, it's the weekend. It's Saturday, the 25th of April. I'm here in Davos, Switzerland, and we are doing a letter. We are continuing on with a letter that Dmitri wrote to his sister from Davos. May have written it on this very balcony on the 23rd of September 1939. I did this recording yesterday, and then when I went to post it, it turned out that I hadn't recorded it. I hadn't pressed record on my phone. That's a little better. I was just adjusting it there. So that was disappointing, but hopefully today I'll do it better. Okay, so our recap, the last small section of this letter that we did was Dmitri linking, comparing the beginning of the Second World War with the beginning of the First World War. Fair enough. I'm sure lots of people were making that comparison, maybe most people. And then linking the Russian Revolution directly to the patriotic ecstasy at the beginning of the First World War that swept the country, at least the urban parts of the country, and saying that this was what paved the way for the revolution and for the slaughter of the imperial family. He specifically references Alapayevsk, where his Aunt Ella and his half-brother were killed, along with two other Romanov cousins of his. All right, so let us get started with today's text, where he'll be talking about his actual experience of being in Davos, arriving in Davos. Okay, only during wartime have I seen a town as empty as Davos. Of course, it is the low season, but beyond that, the Swiss army has been mobilized, and so there are no men to be seen except the elderly, who pass the time here and there. The poor horses, they too have been mobilized, and since they were very scarce in Helvetia to begin with, they are generally not to be found now. I was nonetheless able to get a droshky from the station, but the horse was on its blank, and the coachman walked alongside it. At the Hotel d'Angleterre, I received an exceptional welcome because I was one of only 3 guests staying there. The proprietor couldn't figure out what I was even doing there, but the next day he understood, because with the cloying expression of an all-forgiving father on his face, he approached me, barely restraining his urge to slap me on the back, and said, in quotes, don't worry, I know everything. And tomorrow your room will be disinfected for an additional charge of Swiss francs 750. At first I just stood there looking at him and couldn't figure out what he was talking about. But then he pointed at his chest and said that he too had had la maladie, but had recovered. Everyone here speaks exclusively of la maladie. No one calls the damn thing by its actual name. Imagine how I felt when I went to get a haircut later that day, and the stinking barber said, "It's a good thing you're not sick," meaning he hadn't heard me cough, because all the sanatoriums are closed. The doctors have been mobilized, and the patients have all gone home! Exclamation point. That threw me into a complete panic. I spent the afternoon on the telephone, but fortunately my sauna turned out to be open. I spoke to the doctor and arranged a rendezvous for the next day, Saturday, 2nd September at 11:30 a.m. Before I go on to the comments, I should just say that the word that I pronounced sauna is, and Dmitri puts it in quotes, is actually spelled S-A-N-A, and it's short for sanatorium. So people in Davos, and elsewhere I think as well, referred to their sanatoriums as a sanatorium became a sauna for the people that were patients there, or sauna, I guess, if you want to distinguish it from the steam bath. Okay, so what did Dmitri encounter? He says he's never seen a town as empty as Davos outside of wartime. And then he qualifies that by saying, well, it is the low season. And what is now called the mid-season, that's true. We're in it now in April. The mid-season is April and May. And yeah, everything does empty out more or less. And lots of places close, lots of hotels close. Schatzalp is closed. It's empty now. I'm the only person at the moment actually residing in the hotel, though there are other people in buildings attached to the hotel. There's a villa and there's apartments above the funicular station. But anyway, the hotel is closed, and that's true of many hotels in Davos during the mid-season. Davos is a two-season town. It has a winter season, which is the high season, and it has a summer season, which is also thriving. And Dmitri, and the mid-season would be, precisely in April and May, and then in September, October. So he did arrive during the mid-season. And that was one reason why things would ordinarily be empty, but this time it was extreme emptiness, and he's quite right in saying that that was not because of the mid-season, but that was because of the war, because of the general mobilization. The Swiss were terrified. Germany had gone into Czechoslovakia, Austria, now Poland, and why shouldn't Switzerland be next? They were terrified of that. So of course they called a general mobilization. And this is why there were only old men in town and not many horses. Horses had been requisitioned too. And I wonder if cars had been requisitioned, because Dmitri clearly was not able to find a taxi. Either the taxis were requisitioned or the taxi drivers were requisitioned. So he had to get a horse-drawn carriage, which he refers to as a droshky, using the Russian word. And I had a look at droshkis, at photos of them online, and they are usually two-horse carriages that seat 4 people plus the coachman. And there's a word here that I couldn't make out, but Dmitri is saying there's only one horse pulling the droshky, and this horse was on its blank, I don't know, last legs, I don't know. So the coachman walked alongside it. There would have been plenty of room in a 4-person coach, but apparently the horse needed the coachman to walk alongside it and direct it. Apparently it wasn't doing that well. And it's interesting that Dmitri notes that there was, in general, even outside of wartime, a lack of horses in Switzerland. I never heard that. I'll have to ask around about that. And it's also interesting that he uses the Latin name for Switzerland, Helvetia. Not sure why. Certainly the Russian word for Schweizaria, I think, is the Russian word for Switzerland. So I don't know. For poetic reasons, probably, because as you know, he tended to be a rather poetic writer, and a good writer. You can see in his description of his arrival makes it so easy to picture his interaction particularly with the proprietor of the Hotel d'Angleterre. So a little bit about the Hotel Angleterre. It no longer exists, but it was right in the heart of what was called the English Quarter in Davos. And it's no longer called that. The English Quarter was indeed established by the English colony in Davos, and the first English visitors. They had 2 big hotels. The Hotel Belvedere, which does still exist, and across the street from it, the Hotel Angleterre. And where the Hotel Angleterre used to be, you now have the Congress Centrum, or the Congress Center, or the building where all important and large conferences take place. Obviously, there are sometimes conferences in the hotel, including Schatzalp, but the Congress Centrum is the big one, and it's where the World Economic Forum takes place every year, which didn't exist in Dmitri's time, so I don't know whether he'd be amused or not to know that Where he stayed, that site where the Hotel d'Angleterre used to be, was actually a gathering place for billionaires and world leaders and, yeah, so on and so forth. Anyway, why did he choose the Angleterre? Well, maybe just because it was open. I don't know, although the Belvedere would have been open too, and that's a fancier hotel. It's a 5-star, although the Angleterre was also fancy. But anyway, he doesn't say. Uh, what he does say is very interesting, that there were only 3 people there, and that the proprietor looked at him and thought, what the heck are you doing here? Why are you even here? You know, good question. Why are you here for the mid-season? A Russian Grand Duke in town during the mid-season, uh, with a war breaking out. But of course, he figures it out. So Dmitri had a bad cough, and it doesn't take him too long to figure it out. And then his attitude changes, and he's very patronizing. And poor Dmitri is already so self-conscious about having tuberculosis. And then you have this fellow, okay, he's trying to be nice, right? In a way, he's trying to say, oh, don't worry, I had it too. You know, and it was not at all uncommon for business owners in Chatzalp and for journalists and other people that were living permanently in Davos. Many of them were former sanatorium patients, and they recovered enough to go back to work and to leave the sanatoriums and to have businesses and jobs. But they believed, and whether they were right or not, I don't know, but they believed remaining at the high altitude in the pure mountain air would prevent their tuberculosis from becoming active again. And maybe there was something to that. I don't know. But that's why you had so many people like this proprietor of the Hotel d'Angleterre who were former sufferers. But, you know, Dmitri is not in any mood for this, and he's looking at this guy, and instead of saying, oh, he's trying to do something nice, he's saying he's looking at me like an all-forgiving father. So, as a father, thereby patronizing, and as all-forgiving. So Dmitri himself is, as we've seen, interpreting having tuberculosis as a kind of sin, as a kind of failing and weakness on his part. And he's having these imaginary, he's reporting these imaginary dialogues in the emigre community behind his back of them saying, oh, Dmitri, he went and got himself infected with tuberculosis as though it was his own fault. Anyway, that's how he was feeling in his first month in Davos, in his first month at Chatzalp. And things only get worse. So the proprietor then blindsides him with this additional charge. And it was not a small amount of money. He was paying, I believe, between 27 and 28 francs a week for his room at Chatzalp. Possibly a little less because he wasn't in the fanciest room. But if you compare that, a week at a sanatorium, medical care included, meals included, and you compare that 27 francs, let's say, to the 750 for the fumigation of the room, that's a lot of money. And Dmitri wasn't doing particularly well financially at that point. He apparently had to borrow money to go to Chatzalp because you had to pay for a year in advance. That was the rule. And he couldn't swing that without borrowing money. But, you know, it wasn't, I think, the money that was so upsetting about it. You know, he was blindsided by this, and it added to this sense that he had of being, you know, this contaminated person. They have to fumigate his room. Of course, it wasn't opportunistic on the part of the proprietor of the hotel because it was the law. It was the law in Davos that anybody who had tuberculosis, upon leaving accommodations, those accommodations had to be fumigated. I don't know if if the hotel proprietor was inflating the cost, but I doubt it, any more than any other. They're covering their expenses, and it's the law. Okay. And then we have Dmitri's, it's the mood he's in, but it's also, I think he was a pretty straightforward person. He liked calling a spade, telling things as they were. So he doesn't like this term that everybody is using in Davos at that time, the French term, la maladie. And he'd rather just say tuberculosis. That's the word that he usually uses. Let's not sugarcoat things. And then, the next bad experience that he has that day is when he goes to get a haircut. And the barber there, throws him into a panic by saying, so Dmitri sardonically says he hadn't heard me cough, therefore he didn't think I was sick. And he throws me into a panic by saying, well, it's a good thing you're not sick because the sanatoriums are closed. The doctors have all been mobilized. The patients have gone home. Part of that is true. The patients had gone home. The Russian colony in Davos back in 1914 had disappeared almost overnight. You had sometimes a majority or close to a majority of patients here at Chatzal prior to the First World War were Russians. And they all left, and they didn't return, after that, in anywhere near the numbers they'd been in before. So Dmitri, for instance, while he was here, was the only Russian, the only person who identified himself as Russian staying at Chatzal, whereas if he'd gone in 1913, the place would have been full of Russians. And so a similar thing happened with the outbreak of the Second World War. Everybody's initial reaction was to go home. So the barber was right about that, but he was not right about all the doctors being mobilized. The head doctor at Chatzalp was in his 40s. He had not been mobilized. And Chatzalp was open, and most of the other sanatoriums were open. I can't think of any that actually closed down as a response to the war. I'll have to look into that. But, they were mostly open. So that was an unnecessary cruelty, although I guess to the barber's credit, Dmitri's assessment was that he hadn't done it to be cruel, that he hadn't realized that Dmitri was sick. So this raises the question, or rather it answers the question of whether Dmitri had planned this in advance, and clearly he had not. His doctors in the past who had diagnosed the TB and the doctor taking care of him in the south of France, I can't remember which one, but one of them had recommended Dr. Gustav Maurer, who was indeed a world-renowned surgeon and doctor for tuberculosis patients, and had written to Maurer about Dmitri, but that was before Dmitri had made the decision to go. And clearly it was a spur-of-the-moment decision. He decided to go to Davos. He, parted from Polly, who went back to school, parted from Maria, who was going to the U.S., and was feeling absolutely horrible and thought that train and transportation was going to be cut off because of the outbreak of the war. So he decided, if I'm going to go, I better go now. And maybe he sent a telegraph from the train station in Paris or in Landcourt, but he did not consider that he himself to be expected at Chatzalp. So he immediately goes and gets on the phone to make sure that they're open, and he makes an appointment. He didn't have a previous appointment. He was really flying by the seat of his pants, as the English language idiom goes. And the other big question that arises for me is whether he has a servant with him. And it could be that he did. He doesn't always mention having a servant with him in what he writes about his departure from Russia at the end of 1916. He doesn't mention having a servant with him, but he did have a servant with him. We find that out later in his diaries when he does talk about having this valet, Savonia. But he doesn't seem to have a servant with him going to Davos. You know, he didn't. No servant was looking for a taxi for him or getting the droshky. No servant was, making sure that the sanatoriums were open and that, making arrangements. So he seems to have arrived by himself. I can't 100% verify that, but unlike the case with Savonia, his valet in 1917, who is then mentioned frequently in the next couple of years, no servant is ever mentioned in the Schatzalp letters or diaries. He does talk about paying people who are his employees, sending them checks once he's able to from Davos to Paris, but they were in Paris, they weren't in Davos with him. So my impression is that there's no hidden servant. Anyway, I've gone 20 minutes. I absolutely did not want to do that, so I'm sorry about that. What do we have next time? Next time he is going to describe his initial exam and meeting the doctor, getting his room, meeting the nurse who would be taking care of him. All very interesting stuff, fantastic detail, and I hope to see you then. Bye.